Okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you for joining the Empower Ed podcast, Sarah. Do you want to begin with a little introduction?
Sure. So my name is Sarah Cole, and I have been an educator in DC for the last 7 or so years. I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri, and in my time in DC have worked at a couple of different schools as an educator and as a school leader in different capacities. But I've been really invested in equity work, which turned into a deep interest and passion and pursuit of abolition in education as well.
Yeah, thank you. And that's so important. I do feel like equity is really like a stepping stone to abolition. And hopefully that's something we can talk about today. My name is Caroline Pryor for all of our listeners. And I'm the lead organizer at Empower Ed. I'm very, very excited to talk about this with you because I know this is like your thing, and I'm really excited to dig into this. So I guess our first question then is, can you define abolition in your own words?
Sure. I think abolition is really twofold. I think when people first hear the word abolition, they immediately think about the first part, which is the destruction of systems that are set up and are perpetuating harm, especially harm against marginalized communities. And yes, that is a necessary, critical part of abolition, but again, it is twofold. You can't have abolition without also the creation of new systems, of new ways of being, of new ways of thinking that are meeting the needs of community members, and especially, again, the most marginalized community members. So it is both the destruction and removal of systems that are causing harm and the creation of new systems that will meet people's needs in an effort to prevent harm in the first place.
Yeah, I love that. I think that like building component, the abolition is about building up a new, really like a transformed world for ourselves and our students is something that you're right, most people don't necessarily grapple with when they hear that word. And it's a word that can feel scary, I know, to a lot of people who are hearing it. But I definitely agree with you. And I think one of the quotes that I think about a lot is on Audrey, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. Um, but dismantling is only one component, and the rest is really, I love that abolition becomes so tailored to the community that it's helping.
Has to be.
Yeah. Okay. So why do you think we need abolition in education then?
I think that unfortunately right now, our education system is deeply entrenched with multiple systems of oppression. I could talk about that for a long time, but I think I'll highlight two in particular. One is just the prison industrial complex, which I think we talk about a lot within the education scene. We talk about the school to prison pipeline. We have acknowledged, the ways that literacy rates have been used to predict the number of prisons and prison beds that we need, or the ways that a student's expulsions or suspensions could be predictors of whether or not they might be incarcerated. So I think we are pretty clear on the link between that relationship between our education system and prisons, which is it's obvious and it's harmful.
Mhm.
However, I think we also have a relationship between schools and capitalism, which is a system that was built and established on chattel slavery. It is at its roots something that was built on anti-Black racism. And that racism perpetuates today. Capitalism still results in outcomes that are predictable by race in disparate ways, where people of color are experiencing less housing, people of color have less income, less wealth, have worse health outcomes. Like all of these things can be connected back to capitalism. But we don't really talk about as much or critique as much that relationship between schools and capitalism. Instead, we literally have at one point had most of the country abiding by standards that were all about college and career readiness. We talk about how we want schools to be preparing students to be productive members of society. In so many ways, we use terms that are really centering the value of schools being on creating laborers, people who are going to participate in capitalism. And for students of color, we're saying that the purpose of schools is to prepare them to sustain a system that doesn't sustain them, that is not designed to sustain them. And so that is one of the areas where I think we need to be thinking a bit more about why abolition is needed within education and how we can abolish that relationship between education and a system that is not serving most people in this country. So those are just, but I could also, of course, talk about the relationships between racism and sexism and xenophobia and on and on and on, but their schools have just been so connected to so many systems of oppression. And so it's really needed to remove those relationships and build a new system.
Mm-hmm. And I like this concept of abolition, like a pedagogy as a form of abolition, I think is really, really critical in schools. We talk a lot about inputs versus outputs. That's something that's like very much on the table right now in the education field. But I think recognizing, you're right, one of those inputs that really harms a lot of our students, one of those inputs is capitalism, and that's going to benefit certain people and it's really going to harm others. And it's so conditioned by colonialism, which is what I studied in college, and I can get very nerdy about that. But capitalism was, you're totally correct, engendered by racism, by colonialism, by all of the isms. And we do produce these like really like prescriptive life paths for our students. Yeah, so thank you so much for those comments. How do you see abolition operating in the education field? Where can we inject this mindset?
Yeah. I mean, I think we start by trying to recognize where are the different places where we see that relationship between our schools and our school system and these systems of oppression. And then we work to dismantle those relationships. And then again, that's the destruction part, but then the building part is where I think we really get closer to what abolition promises. And with that, I think we have to really be designing with students and their communities, schools that will meet the needs of students and their communities. And so I think that would manifest in a number of different ways. I think first and foremost, like schools might be more developmentally appropriate. So perhaps they're not only starting at a time that's convenient for their parents' employers, like the time when it's convenient for parents to be able to drop them off and go to their jobs, but like actually at a time that allows kids to get the amount of sleep that we know that they need to get every night. I think we would really be honoring students' developmental ages. I think this happens more for younger kids. We recognize younger kids as being really curious and we structure learning around that. But for middle school kids, as an example, we know that they are extremely social, like they are very socially oriented. And yet we often talk about that as a challenge instead of thinking about how we can leverage that. We call adolescents egotistical when really that level of self-concern is something that's crucial and developmentally not only appropriate, but necessary. How could we be leveraging that in school, allowing them to think about their identity in deeper ways that can support their instruction and their development? So I think first and foremost, we think about what are the actual needs of young people in general. But then again, we need to be partnering with communities and getting a sense of what is it that they need. What is it that our young people need? Do they need more time to be creative? So we need to ensure that we have arts classes. Do they need more time to be thinking critically? And so we really want to have sciences. Do they need time for play? So we want to make sure that even through middle school, even potentially through high school, there's time for kids to just play. And of course, young people are always going to need to know how to read, write, and do math. Those aren't going to be things that go away. However, to your point earlier about like inputs and outputs, the way that we do that, the way that we input that information might look very different than it looks in a lot of places. We might have a lot less skill and drill where we're just trying to like have kids practice these skills and master these things. Instead, we might have what a lot of schools in DC are already attempting, which is project-based learning, where they're developing their literacy and math skills in a meaningful context where they will ultimately have to share their learning in a way that's going to meaningfully impact their community, so that it's not just about learning this skill, but developing their sense of why they need this skill and how it can be impactful in their lives. But I also think it goes down to like things as simple as, like I was saying before, if we are starting the school day later, ensuring that kids have safe transportation to their schools, ensuring that when kids get to their schools, they have healthy meals that they actually want to eat. I have seen so many students go the entire school day not eating because the food that's being served at the school isn't food that basically anybody would want to eat.
Yeah.
So what are
Yeah.
we doing to ensure that our schools are meeting the holistic needs of our students, of our young people, and setting them up to be able to meet the needs of their community as well? And that requires communication and partnership, not just with students, but with their families, with the community members, and all of the community assets that exist within that ecosystem.
Mhm. That asset driven piece is like, so it's so important. And something else that I'm hearing is, I think our education systems, just like in this country, are very hierarchical. You know, like
Mhm.
it's not a lateral process. It's not a process where you usually invite communities in or center student agency, which is another thing I heard you say. And that process is critical to the building component of abolition. It's it also like thinking about the school as extending beyond the building is another like really, really important aspect. And it's hard, I think, a lot of times when we're doing policy reform or things of that nature to make that case that we need to like spill over into other systems, that we need to invite in stakeholders that usually aren't at the table.
Mhm.
And I guess building this around the people who are least often prioritized.
Right.
And in some cases, that is students, because student voice is something that you're supposed to control in a traditional school system. And that control piece, just you're controlling the students, you're controlling the teachers, controlling the funding, and really thinking about how we can break that apart, like you've said earlier, like looking at all of the connections, and those are the places where we need to focus our attention and our efforts. And of course, making sure that it's human-centered first.
I think one of the really cool things about the DC ecosystem in particular is that there are so many organizations and so many people committed to doing different aspects of that work. And so we have examples of like what you were just saying in terms of the school being beyond just like the walls of the building. We have organizations that are dedicated to facilitating just that for schools, and the schools who get to participate in that are able to attest to the impact of having like weekly field trips outside of the building that connect to what the kids are learning inside the building. So the beautiful thing about being in DC in particular is that it is such a resource rich area, and an area not just rich in like financial resources, but in people who are really committed to finding ways to serve young people, and especially serve young people of color. And I think it's a matter of really connecting the dots between those and seeing those success stories, and then advocating for more support and more resources and more resources to replicate the success
Mhm.
of those organizations.
Yeah, I totally like, I really take that piece that like we have the components already. We just need to figure out how to put them together.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and there are certain places in the city that have more access to that than others, and we'll get into that in a bit, but I'm thinking also I want to circle back to the school to prison pipeline, um, that piece, because I think abolition, when we hear abolition most often in like the public lexicon, it's usually prison abolition is the context, and not thinking about like abolition in all systems and all aspects of our lives. But uh, there is a lot of focus on like restorative justice in our schools, and thinking about how like in an abolition world, we reframe that as like the transformative justice piece, right? Where we're
Yeah.
really thinking about not just like working within the systems we currently have, but how can we transform them all together and bring our students along with us on that journey? How how do you see how can we bring restorative and transformative practice into our schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is absolutely a necessary ingredient when we talk about abolition in education, if we do want to disrupt that relationship between schools and prisons. And I think the first step is really just acknowledging how philosophically different restorative and transformative justice are from what most people have experienced most of their lives in this
Mhm.
country. We live in a country that believes in punitive measures, even if punitive measures haven't necessarily led to the results that we would like them to. They have offered people a sense of comfort because it feels like at least something is happening in response to when harm is being done or expectations aren't being met. So I think we have to really acknowledge like it requires several philosophical shifts for people to really buy into restorative justice and really be able to uphold and maintain it. And so I think it begins with acknowledging what are those key beliefs that you have to have in order to practice and believe in restorative justice and transformative justice. And what are your gaps between those beliefs and your current starting point. So for example, one belief that I often lift up in schools is like, we live in a very adultist culture. Restorative justice requires that you respect and honor the emotions, needs, and perspectives of everybody, including young people, and especially young people if we're talking about restorative justice in schools. And so acknowledging like, what has been your relationship with respecting children? Is that something that you can do? And if not, what would it take for you to be able to get there is like one thing that I think comes up for a lot of educators. So first of all, just acknowledging what are those beliefs and doing the work to help people practice unpacking those beliefs and developing those beliefs. And I think that that really has to start with the adults in the building first. I think I have consistently heard the advice and guidance. So I think it's something that's really hard for schools to take, but the advice and guidance to have the adults practice restorative justice for at least a year before it's even introduced to the students. So that way the adults could experience for themselves when I'm not meeting the expectations of my employer. And instead of me just being punished, I'm engaged in a restorative conversation where we figure out what is going on, why it's happening, and what is my accountability and my responsibility in making it happen, but potentially what structurally might need to be shifted so that it's more possible for me to do this. When the adults get to experience the benefits of restorative justice, when adults get to have restorative conversations with a colleague who they may have had some issue with, then they can see for themselves the impact and see for themselves the value and really begin to, I think, have that like experiential education of it,
Mhm.
which can better prepare them then to facilitate those types of conversations, those types of circles with their own students, and also facilitate them from a stance of actual belief and investment in it versus this is something my boss told me I have to do because we're trying not to suspend kids anymore. And so let's have this circle, but I'm going to dominate it and not actually like hear anything that the kids are trying to say. So I think first and foremost, it has to start with the adults. And then once we move to the young people, I think we can't just move to the young people. I think we have to move to the young people and their families. And a similar type of education that we offer to the adults in the building, we offer to the kids in the building and their adults that might be outside of the building, to their families, to frame not only the what of restorative and transformative justice, but also the why. And for everyone involved, I think when we think about transformative justice in particular, there has to also be an education around, I think, equity and systems of oppression, because you can't begin to fully address, like, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again, not just for this person, but for anybody, without having a clear understanding of how systems operate. And so I think there's lots of education that has to happen and lots of practice and patience.
Mhm.
And space and grace for things to maybe not work out right away, but faith that if we continue in this project of trying to address the harm that has been done, repair that harm, and figure out why it happened and redress that, make sure it can't happen again, that we will get better and better to creating an environment where everyone's needs are being met. And I guess I should also mention that I'm talking a lot about like the different protocols and things of restorative justice, but 80% of restorative justice is building relationships. So
Mhm.
really thinking about how are you structuring your staff culture to where there are strong relationships between your staff? How are you cultivating your student culture so that there are strong relationships among students and between students and the adults in the building. And then also, how are you fostering those relationships between parents and between parents and students and parents and the adults in the building? So it's all of those pieces.
And it is a ton of moving pieces, but what I'm hearing is that like the core of restorative justice is that respect and that trust. That's what creates those relationships in the first place. And, you know, thinking about respect and trust and patience as well, that you mentioned as a muscle that you have to exercise again and again and again until it becomes muscle memory, because there's a lot of unlearning here, even if you have some awareness of those systems of oppression. When you are like, I guess, in the thick of it in the school day, you have to like constantly like stop and
Yep.
what thought patterns am I bringing to this moment?
Mhm.
Really like those philosophical shifts that you talked about. There's so much unlearning there that I think each of us is on our own journey in. And I really love the concept of starting within in a school building, in a school setting, starting with the adults, making sure that they really have that buy-in, because experiencing restorative justice is the buy-in. And making sure that you have that component locked down before you move into introducing it to students and introducing it to families, and working with those other members of your school community. But I think something that Scott talks about a lot is that restorative justice at his school was something they introduced to the adults first. And then once they had that lockdown, that's when they really started seeing those shifts in their students and their student relationships. I think there is so much focus also right now in the city on SEL. And I'm so happy about that shift. I think really centering restorative practice within that is also going to be a really big driver of inculcating this abolitionist like mindset in our schools.
At my last school, we really talked about restorative practices being opportunities for students to practice their SEL skills, to practice their like social awareness, their self-awareness, their ability to know what do I need to do in this moment so that I can be good for myself, be good for others. So practicing relationship skills, there's so much fruit that comes from restorative practices for sure.
And SEL as a justice oriented like programming is huge.
Yeah.
Let's pivot a little bit. I was listening to another podcast where Miriam Kaba was talking about how the people that are most like wary of abolition are often the ones that in some ways are already experiencing it. They're already in a situation where they have enough privilege, they have enough resources that if they need second chances, they can get it. If they need to like pivot in some point in their life, like they can do that. They have those opportunities. How do we organize for abolition in education in DC or more broadly to make this a reality for all of our students, to make abolition in education a reality for all of our students?
Yeah, absolutely. I think similar to what I was just saying about restorative justice, like it will require some learning for sure, some community learning. But I also think that there have been so many times I've had conversations with people where they're lamenting gentrification in DC or the crime bill in DC or whatever the issue might be. And the way that they're talking about it, I'm like, oh, you sound like an abolitionist. Like what you're saying, the solutions that you're naming, that's abolitionist thinking. And so while I think that there is some learning that has to be done, I think also just engaging with community members, again, the people who are most impacted by these things, about what it is that is coming up for them and what solutions they think would be better, and then helping them to connect the dots and see, because abolition is just, it's a vocabulary word, I mean, like it is more than a vocabulary, but it is, you don't have to necessarily know everything about it, know the history of it to have abolitionist inclinations. And so I think part of it is just like being in community with folks and helping them to connect those dots between the ways that they're thinking and abolitionist thinking, and then helping them then connect to the spaces, because there are powerful spaces within DC that are doing abolitionist work. And so connecting them to those spaces. And I think something that has been important for me as an organizer is not only finding myself in spaces where I have to justify and defend abolition, but finding myself in spaces where I'm working with other abolitionists who already get it. Only, and not to say that you can't do one or the other, but I think it's important to have a balance of both, because it can be really discouraging if you're in a space where you are having to constantly combat people who are only thinking that abolition is just the removal of police and then it's just going to be chaos. Like, no, if constantly having to defend that position, it can be discouraging. So I think it's important to find the community of other abolitionist organizers and work together to really be connected to, again, the community members who are most impacted, to get a sense of what does abolition look like to them, and how can we start there with designing around those needs and those freedom dreams, so that people can begin to experience what it looks like. And also, I think like there are, again, because DC is such a resource-rich place, there are pockets of DC where people are doing this work in different ways. So we can also just point to the examples that already exist and point to how they're benefiting people to make it feel less scary and to really elevate the designing portion of abolition, the portion of abolition that's really emphasizing what we are creating in place of the systems that we're tearing down.
Yeah, I think you're right that like the abolitionist community in any given space is larger than we think, and it's just not being named as such, because that term you used, freedom dreaming, that's like an intuitive thing, that's an intuitive pattern, and that's really central to abolition. It's really central to abolitionist practice, but it is something that you need to feel safe while you're freedom dreaming and not attacked in that. The same way that we would try to create a safe environment for our students, like that dreaming space needs to be sacred. And so finding that community, and acknowledging that there's like so many different ways to do this work, to create our new systems. But acknowledging that we're all moving towards more or less a vision that's transformative, and that's a shared priority. And we'll come back to that question in a little bit. But when we're thinking about this freedom dreaming process, and we've touched on this a little bit already, but what other systems besides just the education system do we need to tackle simultaneously?
Yeah, it's an important question. And I think I first just want to acknowledge that when we talk about addressing these other systems, it doesn't necessarily have to mean, and actually it cannot mean that schools are the ones doing all of this work. I think we exist with this broad ecosystem where everyone kind of has their corner, their thing that they are working towards, and it's a matter of us being connected in that effort. But if we're talking about what systems would impact the possibility of abolition within schools, I think addressing the first thing that comes to mind is like addressing our housing system. So many students we already know that more than 1 in 3 Black children in DC are living below the poverty line, and that has so many implications. Housing is definitely one of them. It is, I can't fathom what it is that we are even attempting to ask of students and their families in terms of wanting them to show up every day and learn and be fully engaged when they have housing insecurity, when they don't necessarily know where they're going to home at night. Or when they do know, but they know it's not a place where they want to be going. So I think foremost addressing the fact that we have rapidly increasing housing prices in DC, and that is shoving families out. A lot of schools right now are seeing a reduction in their enrollment simply because of that, simply because families can no longer afford to live in this place that they have called home for generations. And it's absolutely absurd. We cannot meet students' needs if they can't even afford to live in the city to be able to go to our schools, or if they cannot afford to figure out how to even show up every day. So I think that's the main one that definitely comes top of mind. I think food access is another one. There's I believe it's called like the grocery report that gets issued, I believe annually, that shows how families in Ward 7 and 8 have just drastically different, less access to healthy food in DC. They have less access even to transportation to get to the healthy food in DC. We cannot, again, expect kids to show up and be their best selves when their bodies are not nourished. And then they come to school and their bodies continue to not be nourished because the food that they're receiving at schools is not anything that they would want to consume. We have to address the transportation system. We talked so much about how important family engagement is. And while we do offer DC, the Kids Ride Free cards, we don't have any way for parents to be able to get to and from their student schools to be able to be active members of it. And then on top of that, we live in a district where 50% of the students are going to charter schools, which means they're going to schools all over the area. And if their families have to travel far distances, and our transportation system is one based on how far you're going. So the further you live from your child's school, the more money you have to pay, and there's nothing that you can do about it. And they've gone through extreme lengths to ensure that people cannot freely access the metro and to criminalize any attempts to freely access the metro. How are we supporting family engagement, family participation in schools when we have not made it accessible for them to even get to the schools in the first place? I think the way that we address crime and safety in DC is something that's honestly like hard for me to talk about. It just feels incredibly anti-Black. The fact that earlier revisions of that DC crime bill were attempting to criminalize, I mean, still a version of this ended up existing in the bill, but if people were wearing a mask and someone thought that they were trying to intimidate them, that someone else's assumption of what you were doing could criminalize your wearing of a mask is just the most absurd, clearly anti-Black, clearly anti-young Black piece of legislation that I've encountered in a long time. And that's, I think, again, where I see a lot of promise in, if schools are really serious and committed to doing the work of restorative justice. Schools have often been the site of change, right? We saw that with desegregation, though that's a separate conversation around like the total implications of that. But I think that there could be a possibility of us really seeing the success of restorative justice in schools, especially if we're really integrating families into that as well, to where that becomes something that we as a community are like, no, we know that this works and we're going to advocate for it more broadly, because the way that we're approaching it right now is not working. It just is not. Full stop. It is not working. It is heartbreaking the number of times that I have to receive a message about one of my own students being harmed, or about a friend of many of my students being killed. Like our kids are not safe. They are afraid. They are being, it's just, they are not allowed to be children under this current system. And then they're penalized and criminalized for it. And it's frustrating to a point of being heartbreaking. That is definitely a system that we would need to address if we could ever really, in order to ever really achieve abolition in schools.
And that's like a very heavy conversation that I would love to talk more about, but I think this system is designed to catch out like a lot of our, especially like our Black and brown students, and then their voice in devising solutions and dreaming up solutions is systematically erased as well. It's just like, it's such an insidious, it's just an insidious system. And I think you've pointed to a lot of spaces where we can build coalitions and where we can work towards displacing those systems, but it's a heavy time in the city right now to be discussing this.
I have to shout out Black Swan Academy and the Trigger Project, because those are two incredible organizations that are making such a profound impact and really elevating youth-centered ideas and voices around how to address these particular issues. Not just the issue of like how we're responding to crime and safety, but broader issues too that like are really helping to elevate the holistic wellness of young people in the city. So I am grateful for the existence of organizations like that, because without them, it would be really hard to experience much hope given how the people in power are operating currently.
Yeah, yeah. Those organizations are doing incredible work. Those youth are doing incredible work. And I think the city should be really, the city owes a lot to them and their voice and their activism. So thank you for naming that. We have a couple minutes left. I have a very big question at the end, and you've been handling a lot of big questions, so thank you. But what is the vision we are moving for? What is your ultimate vision for our schools and our students in DC?
I think it is truthfully not my vision to have. I think it is a vision that has to be co-created and developed with students, with their communities at particular schools. I think it's something that should be happening at the school and then above that, the district level. But it isn't. I've named lots of things that I think might happen, like maybe we would have more developmentally appropriate schools, but at the end of the day, it's not abolition if it's not being designed with the people who are being most impacted by it and the most marginalized people who are being most impacted by it. So I think ultimately my vision is that it becomes something that's much more community controlled. And I think we have histories and legacies of when that has happened in our country, the beautiful fruit that comes from it. And so I hope that we can arrive in that place in DC.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. I feel like I've learned so much from talking with you. And I think I always do. So I am so grateful for your time and your insights. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right.